I landed my dream job, but 2 weeks in, I realized I absolutely hate it. For as long as I can remember, I've had one goal: to escape my small town and make something of myself. I grew up in a place where people rarely left. You were either born there, worked there, and died there, or you somehow managed to claw your way out. I was determined to be in the second category. From a young age, I knew what I wanted: a high-paying job, a career that impressed people, and a life that was completely different from the one my parents had. My dad worked in construction, my mom was a cashier at the local grocery store, and neither of them understood my ambitions. "You're always chasing something bigger," my dad would say. "Why can't you just be happy with what you have?" Because I wanted more. So I worked my ass off. I studied late into the night, took on internships that paid me nothing, and networked with people who barely remembered my name. My entire identity became wrapped up in the dream job, the one that would finally validate all my sacrifices. And then one day, I got the email. A major company, one of the biggest in my industry, wanted me. The salary was higher than anything I had imagined. The benefits were unreal. The title alone was enough to make my old classmates jealous. I had done it, I had won. Or so I thought. Leaving my hometown should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt complicated. My parents were proud, but not in the way I expected. My mom cried when I told her I was moving. "We won't see you anymore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I laughed it off. "I'll visit, I'll call." I didn't realize then how much I was lying. The real tension came from my dad. "So what is it exactly that you'll be doing?" he asked over dinner one night, his arms crossed. I explained my role, how I'd be working for a prestigious company, handling projects that would put my name on the map. He just nodded, but I could tell he didn't get it. "They're paying you that much to sit at a desk all day." It wasn't a real question, it was judgment. That was the last conversation we had before I left. No big send-off, no heartfelt goodbye, just a nod, a pat on the back, and a let me know if it doesn't work out. Moving to the city was overwhelming in all the ways I had imagined. The traffic, the noise, the sheer number of people, it was a shock, but I embraced it. I had my own apartment, my own space, and a job that made me feel like I was finally in the big leagues. The first day at work was surreal. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline. People walked around in expensive suits, talking in fast-paced, business jargon-filled conversations that I pretended to understand. My manager, David, was a no-nonsense guy who had been with the company for over a decade. He welcomed me with a firm handshake and a promise. "This job will push you, but if you survive here, you can survive anywhere." I should have recognized that as a warning. Instead, I took it as a challenge. The first week was a blur of onboarding sessions, endless meetings, and trying to keep up with information that felt like it was being thrown at me a mile a minute. By the second week, the honeymoon phase was already fading. The job wasn't just demanding, it was all-consuming. Emails flooded my inbox at all hours, meetings bled into lunch breaks, expectations were sky-high, and there was an unspoken rule that if you wanted to succeed, you had to dedicate your entire life to the company. The first time I logged off at 6 p.m., I got a message from a coworker. "Leaving early." I laughed it off, but my stomach twisted. The pressure wasn't just implied, it was enforced. By the end of my second week, I was already exhausted. I wasn't sleeping well, I barely had time to eat, and every conversation with my parents turned into an argument. "You're always busy," my mom said during one of our rushed phone calls. "Yeah, because I have a real job now," I snapped before I could stop myself. The silence that followed was heavy. I wanted to apologize, but instead I just said, "I have to go," and hung up. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. And the worst part, I didn't even have time to care. By my third week, I was running on fumes. The job had consumed every part of my life. I woke up at 6 a.m., checked my emails before I even got out of bed, and by the time I made it to the office, I already felt behind. Meetings filled my entire day, and any time I wasn't in one, I was scrambling to catch up on the mountain of tasks I had been assigned. Lunch breaks, non-existent. Everyone just ate at their desks, mindlessly shoveling food into their mouths while typing furiously. If you actually left the office to grab lunch, people noticed. And the worst part, no one complained. The culture here wasn't just about working hard, it was about performing your exhaustion. People bragged about how little sleep they got. "Oh man, I was up until 2 a.m. finishing that deck," someone would say, and instead of sympathy, they'd get nods of approval. It was like a twisted competition. And I was losing. The moment I knew I was in trouble came on a Wednesday night. It was almost 9 p.m., and I was still in the office, staring at a spreadsheet that made no sense to my exhausted brain. My manager, David, walked by my desk and clapped a hand on my shoulder. Good work ethic, he said. You'll go far here. I should have felt proud. Instead, I just felt sick. I packed up and left soon after, but as I stepped outside, I realized something. I didn't recognize this city. I had been here for almost a month, but I hadn't seen anything beyond my office and my apartment. No restaurants, no parks, no nightlife, just work. Wasn't this the life I had dreamed of? So why did I feel so empty? My parents had stopped calling as much. I knew why. Our last few conversations had ended badly. The last time I spoke to my mom, she had asked if I was happy. Of course I am, I had said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. She didn't buy it. You don't sound like it. I got defensive. This is just how real jobs are, Mom. It's not supposed to be easy. There was a pause, then she sighed. I just miss you. I should have said I miss you too. Instead, I just told her I had work to do and hung up. I hated myself for it. But I didn't have the energy to fix it. By my 5th week, my body started fighting back. I was constantly nauseous, my head ached every day, and I could barely keep my eyes open during meetings. Then came the chest pain. At first I thought it was just stress, but one night as I was working late, I felt a sharp, crushing pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. For the first time, I genuinely thought I was having a heart attack. I ended up in the emergency room. The doctor ran some tests and told me it wasn't a heart attack, just severe anxiety and exhaustion. Your body is screaming at you to slow down, he said. You need to listen. But how could I? If I slowed down, I'd fall behind. And if I fell behind, I'd fail. I wasn't ready to admit that I already had. By the time I hit the 2-month mark, I had stopped thinking of myself as a person. I was just an employee. Nothing outside of work mattered anymore. I barely spoke to my parents. My mom still sent me messages, short ones, asking how I was doing, but I rarely replied. I'd tell myself I'll call her this weekend, but the weekend would come, and I'd be too drained to even pick up the phone. Friends, I didn't have any. Before moving, I had this idea that I'd build a new social life in the city, that I'd meet interesting people, go to cool events, maybe even start dating. But I never had time. And even if I did, what would I even talk about? My entire life revolved around work. The worst part was I knew this wasn't normal. I knew this wasn't healthy. But at the same time, I had spent years working toward this. If I quit now, what did that say about me? That I was weak. That my dad had been right. I couldn't accept that. So I kept pushing forward. Even as my body and mind begged me to stop. David, my manager, had started to notice my struggle. At first, he acted like he cared. He'd say things like, "Hey, how are you holding up?" But if I admitted I was struggling, his response was always the same. "Yeah, that's just how it is here." That was it. No solutions, no support. Just deal with it or leave. Then about 2 months in, he changed. He became harsher. If I made a mistake, he'd call me out in front of the whole team. If I asked a question, he'd sigh like I was wasting his time. And then came the late-night messages. At first, it was just emails, "Need this first thing in the morning." Then it became texts, "Hey, can you jump on a quick call?" It didn't matter if it was 10 p.m. or midnight. If I didn't reply immediately, I'd get a passive-aggressive comment the next day. "Not really a team player, huh?" Or worse, "I thought you wanted to succeed here." I felt trapped. I knew this was toxic. I knew no job was worth this. But the thought of quitting made my stomach twist with fear. I had worked so hard to get here. If I left, wouldn't that mean it was all for nothing? One night I finally caved and called my mom. It had been weeks since we'd spoken properly. She picked up immediately. "Oh honey, it's so good to hear your voice." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Yeah, sorry I've been busy." She didn't say it's okay. Instead, she said, "I was starting to think you weren't coming back." I laughed, but it came out hollow. "Mom, I live here now. This is my life." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But you don't sound happy." That hit me harder than I expected. I almost told her everything. How I was drowning, how I hadn't had a full night's sleep in weeks, how I felt like a prisoner in my own life. But instead, I forced a smile she couldn't even see and said, "I'm fine." We talked for a few more minutes, but it was strained. Before we hung up, she said, "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." I promised. I lied. The next few weeks blurred together. Wake up, work, sleep, barely, repeat. My performance was slipping. I was making small mistakes, things I never would have missed before. David noticed. "You're not keeping up," he said during one of our one-on-one meetings. "I need you to step up." I wanted to scream. Step up, I was already giving everything I had. But instead, I just nodded and said, "I understand." That night, I got another late-night text from him. I stared at my phone for a long time. And for the first time, I didn't reply. Not because I was trying to stand up for myself, but because I physically couldn't. I was done. I just didn't know it yet. Ignoring David's late-night text felt like a small rebellion. But the next morning, the consequences hit me hard. When I walked into the office, he was waiting. "Where were you last night?" His voice was casual, but his expression was tight. I hesitated. I needed some sleep. He let out a dry laugh. "Sleep," he leaned in slightly. "Look, if you don't want this job, there are 100 people who would kill for your spot." I should have felt threatened, but instead I just felt tired. I forced out a "got it," then went to my desk, but something in me cracked that day. I couldn't focus, my hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was beating too fast, too hard. By lunchtime, I had to lock myself in the bathroom just to breathe. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing myself. My skin was pale, my eyes sunken. How did I let it get this bad? I should have walked out right then. But I didn't, because I wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. That night, I crashed into bed without even eating dinner. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to my phone vibrating on the nightstand. A call from my mom. I almost ignored it, but something in my gut told me to pick up. "Hey Mom," I mumbled. There was silence on the other end. Then a shaky breath. And then, "Honey, your dad's in the hospital." I bolted upright. What happened?" "Heart attack," she whispered. "It was bad, he's stable now," but her voice broke. I need you here." My entire body went cold. I was supposed to go into work the next morning. There was a major project deadline. David would lose it if I wasn't there. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. "I'm coming," I said. And for the first time in months, I felt certain about something. I didn't even tell David I was leaving. I just packed a bag, booked the first available flight, and got the hell out of that city. When I landed, my mom was waiting at the airport. The second I saw her, something inside me cracked. I had been keeping everything bottled up for so long, trying to prove that I was strong, that I could handle this life I had chosen. But now, standing in front of her, I just felt small. She pulled me into a hug, and I completely lost it. Tears, ugly, uncontrollable tears. She didn't say anything, just held me tighter. And for the first time in months, I felt safe. Walking into that hospital room was surreal. My dad looked smaller, weaker. He had always been this larger-than-life figure, strong, unshakable. But now he was hooked up to machines, his skin pale, his breathing slow. When he saw me, he gave a tired smile. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon, kid." I let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, well, guess life had other plans." There was a long pause, then he sighed. "I know I was hard on you," he said. I didn't want you to struggle the way I did." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I know." Another pause. Then he looked me right in the eye and said, "But I don't want you to kill yourself for a job either." And that was it. The moment I finally let go. I didn't go back to that job. David sent me a few angry emails, but I ignored them. Instead, I stayed home for a while, helped my mom, spent time with my dad. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. I don't know what comes next. Maybe I'll find a new job, one that doesn't consume my entire life. Maybe I'll do something completely different. But whatever happens, I know one thing for sure. I'm never putting a job above the people I love ever again.